We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Iran urges countries to be cautious after report of Venezuela-bound ships. The U.S. news outlet Politico reported that two Iranian naval vessels may be heading to Venezuela, a close ally of Iran, also sanctioned by the United States. Well, what are we to make of all of this, and what does this really mean and signal? For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He's a widely acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst who works with most major news outlets. He's traveled extensively in the Middle East and in Latin America. Caleb Maupin. Caleb, welcome back.
Sure. Glad to be here, as always.
And so your Middle East and Latin America expertise, I think, will overlap here. Iran's foreign ministry warned against miscalculations following a report that Iran may have sent. Now, some say warships, some say naval vessels. Not all naval vessels are warships. What's your take on this story, Caleb Maupin?
Well, that Venezuela, or I should say rather, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and the Islamic Republic of Iran are very, very similar in their economic setup. Very different in their ideology and their worldview and their culture, but very similar in their economic setup, meaning that these are both oil-producing countries where a revolutionary government has taken power, seized control of this oil, and used the oil to restructure the economy. They have restructured their economies around state-run oil resources. They have a government that controls the oil, and by controlling the oil, can centralize the economy. And they've utilized this, natural resource and the proceeds from the state-controlled natural resource to raise their people out of poverty, build schools, build hospitals. Iran at this point has an 80% state-run economy. They have steel mills. They have a whole economy centered around, government-controlled oil. And Venezuela is a similar kind of situation. Hugo Chavez was elected. They proceeded to ratify a new constitution, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which is, headed by the United Socialist Party. They have done roughly the same thing. And the United States doesn't particularly care for either of those countries doing that. The monopoly on the international oil markets is held by the four big super majors, Chevron, BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil. Is threatened by having independent oil exporting countries. You can call them petro-socialists or just independent oil exporting countries. They're seen as a threat. Libya was once such a country, and it was destroyed. Iraq was once such a country. It's also been destroyed. And because both Iran and Venezuela face threats from the United States, they have gotten closer together. Iran has been sending a lot of food. There's entire Iranian supermarkets in Venezuela. There are a lot of, conferences between Iran and Venezuela. There's a facility in Iran called the House of Latin America that facilitates Iran's relationship with Latin America. There are a number of joint ventures business-wise between the two countries. So it shouldn't really be surprising that this relationship between Iran and Venezuela has expanded, possibly. We don't really know exactly the details here, but has expanded to become a military one. We really shouldn't be shocked about that. What I think is particularly interesting and is a very key similarity in both countries is that both countries have a highly politicized military. Now, in Iran, you have the regular Iranian military, but then you have what is the biggest economic entity in the entire country, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Whereas in Venezuela, the actual Venezuelan military receives its military training in Cuba and is a highly politicized military. Support for the government is much stronger in the military than among the civilian population even. But even within the Venezuelan military, you still have a special force they call the Bolivarian militias that are, independent of the actual military, but are ideological, Marxist armed groups. So both countries have a highly ideological military that seems to be, very, very committed to the anti-imperialist goals of the government, whether that be in Islamic terms in Iran or Marxist terms in Venezuela. So it seems like these highly ideological militaries may be establishing a relationship with each other.
Well, the other thing looking at it is if we look at the kind of trajectory of things, that there was the killing of Soleimani. Afterwards, the Iranians struck back. Certainly they gave some fair warning and didn't kill anyone, but there were, in fact, some injuries and casualties the U.S. had, and the U.S. didn't, wasn't in a position to act. They basically tried the Monroe Doctrine in sending ships with diesel fuel, food, and supplies, and now they're sending some obvious Navy ships. But basically, to me, they're establishing the right of independent nations to act as they please on the high seas, to act as they want to, and not be bound by the hegemonic desires of the empire. And they seem to be successful. And to me, I think the U.S. has their back against the wall. The U.S. is spread thin. They're trying to challenge Russia, challenge everyone all over the place. And I don't see where the U.S. is in any position to act completely illegally and start some kind of a war or attack these ships or something on the high seas. Your thoughts about all of that?
Well, it's important to point out the neocons have been beating the drum about Iran and Venezuela's relationship for a long time. The Wall Street Journal would have op-eds by various, right-wing folks. I believe Rick Santorum has raised this issue as well. And this is supposed to be one of the reasons that we Americans are supposed to hate Maduro is because he's friendly to Iran, and that there is a relationship very closely between the Miami Cubans and the anti-communist South American, exile community in Miami and the pro-Israeli Likud wing of Zionism in the United States. They have a very close relationship. The right-wing Israel lobby and the Miami Cuban, South American, people call it the Gusano lobby or whatever. They have a relationship, and they've long had a relationship. And so emphasizing the connection between Israel's top enemy, Iran, and the top opponent of U.S. power in South America, Venezuela, has been a long-standing talking point of theirs. But one thing that I think is most important here is you are absolutely right, Garland, in saying that the idea that Iran doesn't have the right to send ships to Venezuela is pretty ridiculous. Venezuela is a sovereign country. Iran is a sovereign country. And if Iran and Venezuela agree that one ship goes from one country to the other, who is the United States to intervene? But this ties into, really the nature of the outlook of U.S. business and U.S. geopolitical strategists, right? During the Roman Empire, there was an expression. They said, all roads lead to Rome, right? I'm sure we've all heard this. All roads lead to Rome. What is that referring to? It's referring to the way the Romans dominated the known world at the time was by controlling the trade routes. They were the middleman in all global trade. You had to go on one of their roads if you wanted to export or import products. And they were the sole middleman in global trade. And they went around the world, to North Africa, to the Middle East, to Europe. And there were all kinds of kings and all kinds of nations. And they allowed these regimes to stay intact as long as all their trading went through the Roman Empire. And on top of that, they extracted tribute from these kingdoms. And
it was the mafia.
That model of dominating the world was then repeated. We saw with the British Empire and their rise in the 1800s. They wrote about the way to dominate the world was to have the biggest navy, controlling global trade routes. And the first writings on geopolitics we get from British scholars emphasize the role of the Navy. And, you have the rise of press ganging and the obsession with the Navy on the part of the British Empire in the 1800s was about that, playing the same role, being the middleman in all global trade. And I think that the United States at this point, when they just call out two sovereign countries for having ships go between them, is revealing once again that the United States feels like, look, the USA needs to be the middleman in global trade. Who said? Who gives you that right?
When you look at what I think is the development of this, a lot of folks would read this story and think that, it just sprung out of whole cloth. But going back to the initial, when the United States put the sanctions on Venezuela and Venezuela was having trouble getting gasoline, it was running out of gasoline, Iran sent oil tankers escorted by military vessels. The United States said, don't do it. Iran said, stop us. And the vessels got there. To your point, there are grocery stores now, Iranian grocery stores that have opened in Venezuela. So it seems as though the parties involved here have been pressing the issue and successfully for quite a while. And now this just seems to be one more step, or as Pink Floyd would say, one more brick in the wall that is going towards the reduction of the relevance of empire. Is that a stretch? Too far?
I don't think it's a stretch too far at all. And you have to remember, the USA during the Trump administration, during the early years, was almost on the brink of intervening in Venezuela. But the presence of Chinese military ships in Venezuela very much deterred that. And the fact that Russia is very much an ally of Venezuela also deterred that. And Iran and Venezuela are not the huge superpowers that Russia and China are, but they have a relationship with Russia and China that seems to be very, very helpful to them. And during the Cold War, one of the main strategies of the United States was to kind of, terminate the relationship or try to weaken the ties between what they referred to as satellite countries of the Soviet Union. Now, they claimed that Cuba and Libya and Romania and Czechoslovakia, these were satellite countries. And so there was a huge effort to give financial aid to these countries, to send U.S. forces to be friendly to these countries and try to break that relationship between the so-called satellite countries and the Soviet Union. Now, it appears that the United States, if they are looking to roll back the influence of Russia and China, which they may intend to do, it's going to be very difficult to weaken the relationship between Iran and Venezuela and the relationship they have with Russia and China. And that may be a strategy that they are pursuing, but it's not going to be very effective. And the more they attack these two countries, the more they're going to get closer and friendlier to Russia and China. And, we saw that with Belarus. Belarus is very much a smaller country. It's headed by Lukashenko, maintains a state-run economy. And it was drifting into the U.S. camp recently. And it was having friendly ties to the United States. It was fighting with Russia. And then their election happened. And what happened? There was instability. All the U.S.-backed NGOs were in the streets protesting. And now relations between Belarus and Russia are tighter and closer than they have ever been. And they are closer to China as well because they feared they were facing a regime change or the potential fomenting of civil war. And so now this so-called, what U.S. strategists would refer to as a satellite country is closer to Russia and China than ever before. And that these regime change strategies, they tend to actually, in the short term, they tend to actually strengthen the anti-imperialist bloc of countries. They tend to get closer to each other. And what was key for the United States during the Cold War of weakening the relationship between the so-called satellites and the Soviet Union, that strategy seems to not really be playing out very effectively at all. At this point, many developing countries are getting closer to Russia and China every day. And in fact, in Africa, we see a number of countries that are not Marxist, that do not have state-run economies, that are getting closer to China simply because it's a good place to do business. And Russia is doing that as well. Russia is expanding its business ties in Africa, and there are many countries that have no revolutionary or left-wing history that are getting closer to Russia and China. So the strategy of the United States, for dominating the world, the United States is simply, losing its influence. At the end of the day, as the United States screams that, you're not allowed to do business with Russia, you're not allowed to do business with China, they can scream that as loud as they want, but the force that used to come behind those words and the ability to punish and isolate countries has significantly decreased.
Caleb Maupin, as always, phenomenal analysis. We knew you were the right one to turn to on this issue. As always, man, we appreciate it, and we look forward to having you back.
Sure. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.